Game of the Year. It is never an easy decision to make, as there is a lot of good games that came out this year, but one in particular pushed the medium forward and is extraordinary enough for us at GameSpot to make it the Game of the Year. That game is Half-Life Alyx. We know this is not a game that anyone can play right now because of hardware limitations, stuff that some of us here at GameSpot just have a privilege to be able to use. Ultimately, access did play a part in the debates for Game of the Year, but also quality and innovation does as well, and Alyx delivers in bucket loads. So to start peeling back the layers on all of this, we are being joined with Jake Dekker and Michael Higham to talk this whole thing out. Yo dudes, what's shaking?
Hello.
Hi.
So to kick this conversation off, Jake, I'm gonna throw it to you because Michael, you actually reviewed the game. So
I sure did.
Yeah, so you had your moment, but we'll get to you in just a second. So Jake, give me your elevator pitch as to why this game is so important.
I mean, Half-Life Alyx does what Half-Life games do. It pushes the medium forward in new and interesting ways, and usually the foundation is built around tech. Half-Life 2, for example, had the whole physics engine, which elevated that game, and this does something similar with VR. But, it's not just a gimmicky VR game. It takes all of these different aspects and brings them into one game, and it does most of that, if not all, to near perfection, at least as what we can expect with VR tech as of now.
To that point, as somebody who played, this is my first VR experience, and someone who's also familiar with the Half-Life franchise, it didn't just deliver as a Half-Life game, but it completely warped my perception of VR, which we'll get into later. But Michael, you're up. Tell me about it.
Oh man, as Jake said, that Half-Life has a history of being groundbreaking, and Half-Life Alyx does just that. Like, I played a lot of VR games, and I'm also a longtime Half-Life fan. I've been there since the first game, and the expectations are high, and you go into this thinking like, how can Half-Life exist in 2020 after 13 years since Episode 2? Like, the franchise to many of us has kind of lain dormant, but if it were to come back, the expectations are high. What can it possibly do? And it brings so many elements that we've seen from different VR games, some that have done them extremely well, like reloading a gun, puzzles, movement, horror, action. It brings all of those things together in one full game. Those are things that Half-Life has always done too. I remember going through Ravenholm and in Half-Life 2 and just being absolutely scared of what could possibly happen next. You get that in this game, and the wild firefights that you get into, and then the physics puzzles and playing around with physics. It's all there, but it's not just the fact that we have a new Half-Life game at this level of quality that pushes video games forward, but it also pushes Half-Life as a franchise narratively in some very unexpected directions that we can really get behind, and that kind of reinvigorates our passion for the franchise.
I think there's so many points to make, Michael, that you just said too, and I think one of the most obvious things is that this is a franchise that was seemingly dead. It was kind of like this unbelievable wish that we would ever get a follow-up to Half-Life 2, let alone Half-Life 2 Episode 2's ending. And of course, we all had our, at least I personally was quite skeptical of the idea of them coming back, let alone in VR. And even furthermore, a prequel, at least on surface level to some degree. But yeah, the game not just like completely follows up on its ability to like reassert itself as one of the most important franchises in the medium, but on its own merits, aside from it being a Half-Life thing, is just it's unadulterated game design is the best way I can kind of put it. And like how you mentioned, like this like Half-Life 1 and 2 has always had a way of transitioning from horror to action to puzzle solving to environmental storytelling. But this one, Alyx specifically, it's Ravenholm throughout the entire game. Like that game interlaces horror and terrifying moments within blinks of going into a gunfight with a combines or solving a puzzle and then suddenly being thrusted right back into a dark pit with nothing but a flashlight and a shotgun to fight an enemy you've never even seen before.
4 shells left. Out of shells.
You're never patronized. Like that game is always perfectly leading you along without ever actually having to tell you anything, but everything you do is instinctual. And that, I think, also is a testament to the fact that VR, the way they handle VR, is just immersion times 100. For you, Jake, you said something really amazing where it was, it breathes life into VR for you. And for someone like me who's like not that experienced with VR, like I feel like this dwarfs my experience of the entire medium going forward. But like, Jake, elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's very hard to play VR games that aren't Half-Life Alyx. I picked up a Quest a while ago, and I used it to play Half-Life Alyx, ran great, but ever since then, I've had a lot of trouble going back to different VR games. But I think, like, the big thing that really stands out, and you mentioned it too with how the game is designed, all the puzzles and whatnot, but it really makes you rethink how you play video games, which sounds really dumb when I say that, but
I mean, that's the nature of Half-Life, dude.
I know, right? But like when you actually get hands on it, it's interesting because like normally there's a button to throw a grenade, right? But in this, it's more you pull the pin and you're not just chucking it. You can kind of determine, like there are areas where you're just above enemies and you drop the grenade on them, or you try to throw a grenade through a vent in order to open up a door or clear out some rubble. And even it comes down to reloading, right? Like I've had issues where I've grabbed a magazine out of my backpack, put it in, and then accidentally hit the eject button. And then I'm on the floor trying to find my magazine so I can put it back in before an enemy gets to me. And that's just something that, you know, I've played a lot of shooters. I've played a ton of video games, but that is an experience that has never happened before and can only be done in VR.
Yeah.
And like it's so hard to describe like how pulse pounding those moments and those sensations are, and it's something that just cannot be matched with other shooters.
I mean, like the game, it like it reconditions you in so many ways.
Totally.
Like on when you're like, for me, like first starting that opening segment of the game. And like the first time in which you can pick a marker up and write on the window, like we've all seen it. Like it's within the opening 5 minutes of the game. But it's like it's moments like that it rewires your brain. That moment, not like for me, it wasn't reloading a gun that really like blew me away, although it did. But like being able to write on a window with a marker, it completely
set the tone.
It basically sets the language of the game you're about to experience from that point on, even all the way down to loading your gun, which again, like fumbling around, or even the fact that like every single bullet actually counts, because if you eject a clip, you lose the ammunition that's in that clip, and it makes you think about gunfights and how you're interacting with things all much differently. I want to kind of pivot. You know, we've talked a lot about how this game can't be Half-Life Alyx without it being in VR, but it's important to address, you know, that there is a barrier to entry with this game in many ways, and it's beyond just hardware too. It's, you know, it's a lot for a lot of people's motion sickness. For a lot of people, it's like the physical ability to actually like put yourself into this scenario, and like that's something I kind of want to touch on real quick because, you know, Half-Life Alyx is doing a lot for VR as a medium. It's doing a lot, in my opinion, just in reminding people what amazing point A to point B game design is. But there's also a lot of things that this game does in VR for accessibility, for people who might not have the space they think they need or motion sickness that's helping it a lot. So like that's just some of the stuff I want to talk about because like we've all lived in different scenarios, all three of us who played this game. Like Jake, what was that like for you? Like what did you use to play it? And what was like the space that it was that you experienced it in?
So yeah, I played this game on an Oculus Quest using Oculus Link, which is basically plugging in the headset to a 3.1 port on a PC. I mean, it ran great. One of the bigger worries that I had was that I wouldn't have enough space. However, I was able to play through most of the game seated, and it worked out pretty well. When I was feeling excited, I would move my bed to the side and play with a bit more space, and that was definitely felt more freeing to be able to walk around a little bit, kneel down, pick things up and whatnot. I played most of it seated, and it worked great for me.
Michael, what about you?
Yeah, I think that as I've seen VR evolve, Half-Life, not only is it the new example, the new high bar that VR games should be aiming for in terms of game design, it's also the new bar for control. Because, like Jake mentioned, he played most of it seated. I did too. And at the time of playing the game, I had a really small corner in my apartment that that was the only space I could use. It accommodates how much space you have. It also accommodates some of the controller limitations you might have. There is a single controller option. So the game is designed to work if you can only use one controller. I would imagine it's a hard thing to work around if you want to build a game as detailed, as medium pushing as Half-Life Alyx, but Valve pulled it off exceptionally well. I think another thing is locomotion. This is a huge thing for me because artificial locomotion, where, like, for example, you push a stick forward and your VR character moves forward, that throws me off big time if I do it for like longer than 5 seconds. After that, I'm like, oh snap, I need to get out of this thing. But Half-Life Alyx does a thing where you can play with both of those things enabled simultaneously. So when I was playing, if I want to fit into explore like a tight corner, but I can't quite, teleport to exactly where I need to be or to get to that cabinet high up, I would be able to use artificial locomotion to get in the right position and then reach. But for navigating bigger environments, I can use teleportation. So you have access to both ways of movement as you play this game. And I think that that's incredibly important because you don't have to choose between one or the other. And I think like a lot more VR games should take note of that. Progress is being made, and Half-Life Alyx is an example of that.
Yeah, I think like for me, I live in a studio apartment, and I managed to play it. I decided to play the whole thing standing up. And also, admittedly, I did or may have punched my wall a few times. Whether it was like,
did that too.
Yeah, whether it was from like complete stricken fear or me like shooting around the corner at one combine, pulling a grenade out of the air and tossing it in the other direction and just smashing my fist at the wall. There's marks on my wall because of that. That was a fault of me trying to be like, I want to do this standing up. I want to be full force. This is my first VR experience, because otherwise all my VR experiences leading up to this have been like smaller games, and a lot of them are honestly made me sick or I found really gimmicky. And I was kind of skeptical of the entire medium at this point, being like, I'll just have to wait and see where this goes years from now. But after playing this game, my skepticism is gone. It's like I'm so unbelievably all in, to the point where, like, I've said this many times, but I think it's ruined me.
One left.
There's one last thing that we need to talk about. So we're not going to spoil anything for any of those who are watching this who hasn't played it, but it's important that we do talk about the final act of this game, which we've talked a lot about what it's done for the medium. We've talked a lot about what Half-Life has done just for games in general. But this ending, the ending of this game, kind of does a little more than it's hard to explain, but but it recontextualizes the entire franchise. I think it completely repositions everything we've played and seen in these games and puts it in a different light. So, Jake, you were not familiar with Half-Life prior to this, or at least you were like not someone like maybe like Michael and I who love the franchise. Tell me about that experience, because I have my own kind of reaction to that whole thing, but I really want to hear it from you and like how that kind of meshed and molded your entire experience of the game.
Yeah, so I played through Black Mesa, Half-Life 2, Half-Life 2 Episode 1, and Half-Life Episode 2, probably March. So the month Half-Life Alyx came out, I was running through all those games because I was very excited for Alyx as someone who's into VR, but I wanted to know, what happens, at least generally. And I think as someone who wasn't super invested in Half-Life beforehand, those final moments hit really hard, even though I didn't have a lot of context, or at least I wasn't waiting for a Half-Life game for 13 years like some people were. But I think as I guess sort of an outsider, I think what they ultimately did is really smart, because like you guys said, it recontextualizes things rather than just straight up starts answering questions that people have been wondering for a long time, or even just kind of continue right where things left off. I think Half-Life Alyx does a very good job of saying, like, we are going to honor what happened in these older games. They are still very important to the story, but we want you to know that what you've experienced, what you thought Half-Life was, isn't necessarily what's going to happen going forward. And it makes me super excited to see what Half-Life 3, dare I even say that, will look like in a couple years, a couple decades, who knows.
This fool said a couple years.
Yeah, I would assume that we're just assume you're not going to get it.
That's kind of where I'm at right now, and I'd be okay with that. No, I wouldn't. I really want more.
Michael, the floor is yours.
If we're going to talk about how it concludes without spoiling it, I will say that, that last chapter, that last hour kind of brings it all together. And Half-Life Alyx does a thing where the entire game takes place in one day. And it's through the eyes of Alyx, who's, I also say in my review that I think Alyx is one of the stronger personalities in the Half-Life universe. But I'm really glad that this game centers around her and her relationship with her father and the events that had unfolded around that. Throughout the game, I was kind of like, okay, what is this leading into? What are we actually working towards? Like, a lot of exciting things had happened throughout the story, but I was kind of wondering in my mind, okay, like, what's the conclusion? How is it going to conclude in a strong way? And that chapter exceeds that expectation with a very, very powerful ending for those who have played Half-Life games. And because it creates, like y'all said, it creates this thing where Half-Life can be much more than what we thought it could have been 13 years ago. That's not an easy thing to pull off, and Half-Life Alyx does that. I think that's all I'll say about that, because otherwise, those who might be hyped up to actually make the jump to play this game, I think that's as much as I want to lead them on to say that the conclusion of this game is it's well worth it. The game itself is incredibly fun and exciting to play through, but once you make it to the conclusion is, I think, when you really truly realize that this is Game of the Year material, and why I also think it's up there with, when you think of games of a generation.
I don't want to just regurgitate what we all kind of have said over and over and over again, but Jake, there was one time we were talking about this whole thing, and you had this amazing thing about its place in your Steam library. Tell me about that, because I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to see. As of now, Half-Life Alyx is difficult to play. You need equipment, you need money, you need a PC and whatnot. But I think it's worth pointing out that in 5-10 years from now, when VR is more accessible, this game will be in everyone's library, I think, to some extent. Because you look at Half-Life 2, you look at Team Fortress and a bunch of other Valve games, rarely do you ever see someone's Steam library and they don't have those games, and I anticipate Half-Life Alyx will be something similar. So I think that's all to say that as more people get their hands on this game, I think more people will start to understand its impact, and some of that can be a bit difficult to see because the game sold well for a VR game, but it's not everyone can play it yet, and I think it's still kind of waiting for its time in the sun, which hopefully happens sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think it'll surely be a big thing for me, and what defines a game of the year is at least what I perceive something to have like almost an immediate legacy. Simply put, I will never have this experience ever again. Period. Like, that's it. I won't ever be able to have it again. Not until maybe, somebody comes along and outdoes it. But even then, it's like I will always have had that eureka moment in Half-Life Alyx, in VR, in this place. So that's it. That is us telling you why GameSpot's Game of the Year is Half-Life Alyx. All right, Michael Higham, Jake Dekker, I'm Kurt Indovina. Thanks, folks. Thanks for coming by. Thanks for indulging. Now, do your best to try and maybe consider playing the game. You should. Okay. All right. See ya.
Total waste of grenade.
Worth it.
Agreed.